So beautiful people, I just listened to that unbelievable interview of Bud Crawford with Andre Ward. And let me tell you this, so many gems were in that interview, but let's be honest, one thing stuck out, and it was Terence Bud Crawford talking about the Virgil Ortiz and Boots Ennis situation. He was like, listen, both men had their chance to fight me. Virgil had his chance to fight me and said no, and Boots had his chance to fight me and he said no. So basically, both of them ducked me. Now, let's talk about it, beautiful people. Listen, let's talk about actually the Virgil side first. Listen, I heard it with both of my ears. The WBO president, Gilberto Mendoza, he went on a show and he literally said word for word that Virgil Ortiz, we ordered him to fight Terence Crawford twice and he declined the opportunity twice. So I don't think there's actually a debate like when it comes to the Virgil situation, and I'm not saying that Virgil himself actually ducked Boots, actually ducked Crawford, Terence. But, you know, if you actually, you know, because if anyone knows me, you know that I absolutely love Virgil Ortiz. Go back to my videos. Every time I talk about him, I say Virgil Ortiz, one of my favorite fighters. But, you know, I don't blame him. It's about Oscar De La Hoya, let's be honest. You know, his promoter, his advisors, his dad probably also, you know, they play a massive part and massive factor when you talk about the situation when it comes to picking and choosing the fights. But the truth remains that Virgil Ortiz was the mandatory challenger twice for Bud Crawford for the WBO strap, and he declined twice. So that's the Virgil situation out of the way. Let's talk about Boots. Let's talk about Jaron Boots Ennis, the pride of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Now, I also heard with both of my ears Jaron's dad saying word for word that when we got offered the Crawford fight, we said no because of our loyalty to Steven Espinoza and Showtime. Interesting. When was that? That was when Bud Crawford fought David Avanesian on a app called BLK Prime. You know, the people of BLK Prime actually contacted Team Ennis first before they contacted Team Avanesian. They wanted to make the fight with Bud Crawford versus Boots, but you know, it's obvious that Team Boots declined the fight. And whenever I talk about Boots or Virgil turning down Crawford, I'm not saying that Boots is terrified of Bud and that Virgil is scared of Crawford. Of course, they're all fighters, they're all dogs, and they all got power, they all got pride. So when Team Ennis or Team Virgil declined to fight someone like Bud or any other fighter, it's not because they're terrified of them. It's because it simply didn't make sense at the time. Now listen, in my personal opinion, I believe that Crawford would have beat both of them, but especially Virgil. You know, I believe Virgil would be very similar to the Spence fight. You know, Virgil, you know, pressure fighter, but he would definitely struggle with someone like Bud Crawford, who's dynamic, switch hitter, got knockout power, everything and anything you can think of. But when you talk about the Ennis fight, it's definitely more competitive in my opinion stylistically when you compare Ennis and Virgil. But nonetheless, that did happen. Like, whatever you want to say, they both got the opportunity to fight Bud, but they both declined it. Now, if you actually think about it now, The reason why I believe that Boots Ennis isn't really interested in talking about Bud Crawford or his fight versus Canelo is because the man is hurting. The man knows that deep down he had a chance to fight Bud, but not because of his fault, maybe because of his team, they turned that fight away. And I kind of have an idea on what happened, if you actually think about it. They were with Showtime. Showtime were promising them massive fights, and Showtime were telling them, don't fight Crawford, let's box him out. They weren't going to give Bud the fight versus Porter. They weren't going to give Bud the fight versus Spence. They didn't want to give him also the fight versus Jaron. So it's almost like PBC and Al Heyman and Showtime, they were trying to box Crawford out. They were trying to, freeze him out of the action that's been going on in PBC and Showtime and whatsoever. But the truth remains, and the truth will always come to light. And Bud Crawford, even though all of them, they tried their absolute best to freeze him out of the action that's been going on in boxing for the longest, but the man kept on persevering, and Turki Al-Sheikh came in, took him under his wing, and gave him all the big opportunities in big fights. And listen, it all started with that Spence fight. If it wasn't for Errol Spence, that fight would have never happened. Because if you actually think about it, Al Heyman told Spence for the longest, for years, we don't need that fight. You have your audience, you have your fan base, you can sell, you're a champion, you're a unified champion. You don't need Bud, you don't need that trouble, you don't need that smoke. But because Spence is an absolute dog, and not just that, because Spence definitely wants to get paid. Because he knew for a fact that he was never going to make that 25 to 30 million that he made versus Bud. He wasn't going to make it. And he didn't make it versus Ugas. He definitely didn't make it versus Danny. Definitely did not make that amount versus Sean Porter. So the man knew that it was his only option to make that 8-figure payday over whatever it was, 25 to 30 million, whatever it was. But Spence knew, And that is why Spence kept pushing for the fight. And if it wasn't for him, that Crawford fight would have never happened. And on the Bud side, that was his coming out party, the way that he made his entrance, the way that he promoted the fight, his performance, in my opinion, the greatest performance I've ever seen in my life. When you talk about the squared circle. When have you ever seen someone in the top 5 pound for pound rankings getting absolutely dominated, getting dropped from pillar to post, beat up, bashed up, whatever you can think of? That was all because of the greatness of Bud Crawford. And now getting back to the main topic regarding Boots and Vergil. They both definitely had their chances of fighting him, but now you see Vergil saying that I'm willing to go up to 160 to fight Bud. Even though I love Virgil, but where were you 3-4 years ago when you had 2 chances to fight Bud? But now it is too late, and Bud will simply he's simply never gonna fight Virgil or Jaron, and rightfully so. Is because when he kinda needed them, because he didn't really have a massive star when it comes to a dancing partner, they both gave him the runaround. They both gave him the cold shoulder. But now, because he's the face of the sport, the absolute king of kings, pound for pound #1, 3-time undisputed champion, 5-division champion, and simply the man just headlined on Netflix, nearly 70,000 in attendance. The man, he's currently the man in the sport. He is the man to beat. But it is, in my opinion, way too late for both of them to come around now, the negotiating table, and ask for a fight versus Bud. And just like I'm saying that I cannot blame them for avoiding him in that situation, I cannot blame Bud for telling them, listen, you had your chance, you're not going to get the fight, you're never going to get the fight. And if you actually think about it, who makes sense for Bud? If anything, when you talk about Virgil and Jaron, they make sense for each other. I don't believe that Virgil versus Bud makes any sense, and I don't believe necessarily that Jaron versus Bud makes any sense. So if anything, they should both step up finally after both fighting, I'm not saying that they have been fighting horrible opposition. If anything, actually, I kind of like Virgil's resume more. If you actually think about it, when you talk about the pure toughness and power and sturdiness of the opponents, I kind of like the Virgil resume more than the Jaron. But that being said, cannot blame any of all three men for whatever decisions they made or they will make. But the only fight to make now is Virgil versus Boots, and that's the bottom line.